So what they're saying is that they only want the player to be on the strategy level, and they've basically to do this, you do not move units directly on the map or make decisions about which units should be initiating a battle where. Which, let me remind you, was a feature of literally every single Paradox grand strategy game that has ever been released. Even Europa Universalis 1, like fucking 25 years ago or whatever, right? Which is a bit nuts when you consider all the technology that like can be used for a game in 2021, right? Like all the moving parts that can be calculated with more than one processor, like games all the way up to, I don't remember, I think U4 though, for Paradox only use one core on your actual processor. Like if you have an 8 core, it only uses one core. Now I'm guessing that they've figured out how to use more than one core, and they simplify the game. I have a theory as to why, and I'm pretty sure that's not even a theory. It's a very qualified theory as to why this is the case. I don't think that this is a question of action. See, here they're presenting it. Of course, it's PR. They have to present it as this game vision, right? Like, our vision is to make a entirely diplomatic / economic focused game where the sort of sandboxy simulation aspects that are important are in the realm of, again, the sort of diplomatic and economic peacetime, right? We want war to not be the focus of this, and blah 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 blah. But nothing really, I think, would have stopped them from realizing that vision had they actually implemented a system that's closer to Hearts of Iron 4, where you can automate the warfare, and it still happens on the map. You can still see the units moving around, and you can still manage it if you want. And you can still focus on supplying and allocating troops to front lines, right? You can still do the focus of like, you can still place the focus rather than on the tactics on how do I prepare the war, how do I sort of set up my supply lines, how do I blah 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 blah, how do I sort of make the diplomatic plays to make sure that the enemy is isolated and I'm not, how do I prepare the political groundwork in my country to make sure that there's no random revolution if the war goes, long. They could still have put the focus on that and still had the units on the map. Instead, they decided to remove the units from the map. Of course, I don't think they think it's more fun, and I don't even think, because of course there's going to be some people who sort of conspiracy theorize that like Paradox is dumbing down the game to try to appeal to a wider audience, which I think is stupid. Like, think about how you're reasoning. I've read some comments to this effect. Reason. Why would they dumb down the game by removing the part that's the most fun? Like, if you're playing Call of Duty, right? And if they want to dumb down Call of Duty, okay, I've just realized that I'm stupid, but like, hypothetically, if they wanted to dumb down Call of Duty, would they do it by, I don't know, removing the most fun guns from the game that take the sort of the least skill to use? Or would they do it by removing the more complex items and focusing harder on the sort of simpler stuff? Lowest common denominator. I personally believe, maybe I'm too much of a monkey, I'm too much of a gorilla, but I personally believe that probably most people play these games first and foremost for the war. Because again, it is that part that engages the brain the best, because you've got moving parts, right? Like, it's fun for someone as deranged as me to look at the numbers on a factory and be like, oh ho ho, the green line go up because I made the thing. And I get the dopamine from that too. But I think that it is more likely that you're going to attract more people by making sure that the funny numbers when they're actually moving around armies and fighting battles are more engaging, right? That's what I would think would make the game more appealing to a wider audience, right? So we have removed the hypothesis of game vision, because they could still have, they're not these this is not a zero sum game between having units on the map and fulfilling the game vision, right? You could have had both, literally. There's a but to that, and we'll get to that later. Second one, we have removed the sort of lowest common denominator dumbing down of the game hypothesis, because it doesn't make any sense, and we have removed the they actually think it's going to be more fun to play a paradox coin strategy game without micromanaging armies at all, because again, it's not zero sum between, they could still have had the armies on the field and have the AI automated, right? Okay, there's all those hypotheses don't make any sense, right? What makes sense is the fact that to code an AI that can, like, the coding of the AI probably takes a long time. Now, I'm not a game developer and I'm not a product manager or a project manager, so take all of what I'm about to say with a massive fucking grain of salt. To program the AI to not only manage all of the sort of diplomatic and peacetime aspects, but also to manage armies in an efficient and engaging enough way that the player feels like they're sort of at least partially a match for them, probably takes a lot of developer time, a lot of development resources, because when we're talking about game development, coding and this sort of labor is extremely precious when you've got deadlines. Plus, we'll get to later, there are some very specific circumstances going on at Paradox right now, to where I think if you want to release this game somewhat soon, in the next few months, and they probably need to do that because of their sort of because of Paradox's company sort of situation, you need to cut some corners somewhere. So what I think happens is, and I'll explain why with a bit of a more developed argument in a little bit. What I think happened is that they do not have the development time really to make a good AI for warfare. Again, this is 100% without any evidence, but it is an educated guess, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. So, my conspiracy theory. To understand why they removed war from Victoria Free, you need to understand the labor theory value. Now, the labor theory value is a theory that was posited by economists, that sort of classical economists that studied the beginnings and the development of capitalism, right? Today, we live in a developed capitalism, but it is at least my opinion and the opinion of a lot of very smart people that this theory is still fundamentally correct. What does this theory try to explain? Why, at least under a capitalistic economic system, why do we value objects and services, known as commodities? And so why are we compelled to produce and exchange them, right? And the answer is very simply, again, this is not like, don't take this as an academic explaining things, but go read if you want to know more. But like very, very basically, like explaining to a 12-year-old like me, because the value comes from the labor that was used in producing or acquiring said item, right? If we could manifest items out of the power of our own mind or whatever, like in a fantasy setting, then the labor theory of value would be disproven, at least for those items that can be manifested with the magic of our brain. But since this is not the case, and material reality is the primary and only way we have of understanding the universe, in the material world, even if you find something in nature, you still have to go through the labor of like picking the apple from the tree, right? And then transporting it to either the person that wants it or you eat it on the spot. Now, these commodities have a value that is determined generically by the labor that is input into that item's production. This means that when you exchange these commodities, you have a lot of values, a lot of value types that go into it. Basically, subjectively, what I want, for example, let's say we have a commodity like this curable T-pose sticker on a PNG. The value that I have intrinsically, what does that come from? Well, Marx believed it was divided essentially between use value and exchange value. Now, use value is the qualitative aspect of what is the person getting out of this item. So, for example, with this curable T-pose sticker, my broken brain is entertained by this object, therefore I want to possess it. I want to look at it. The exchange value is the value that comes into play when this item, this commodity, is exchanged with something else. So, for example, I can send it over to someone in my Discord server, and they're going to send another meme back, and that's a value exchange. This is a quantitative process. Or I suppose I could like print it onto a piece of paper and sell it to someone. Or if I were the one to have drawn it, I could sell it to someone for some money. Now, this means that, in fact, it is the exchange value that is at the basis of the price of items. It is not the utility of the item that determines the price. The utility of the item is a very subjective thing that, for example, I can have a use value for something that is several times higher than the market value, right? Therefore, when I go and exchange it, I personally will be prepared to, pay more money for that, but it is not a direct relationship. Exchange value being at the base of prices of items, along with a bunch of other stuff like, market factors, supply and demand, blah, 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 means that money, which is also a commodity, is a stored value. Now, why the fuck am I explaining all of this? Because this is the basic way in which capitalism works, right? Capitalism is a system that attempts to basically make the exchange of goods and services for profit as smooth as possible. It is a system that is aimed at maximizing the profit of basically economic actors, right? So if I exchange this curable T-pose sticker with another commodity like money or another meme, someone sends back a meme when I send them this meme, I am doing a value exchange. Value exchange is what the companies want. The companies want is the profit that derives from basically production and the exchange of commodities. Therefore, we live in a capitalist society. Wow, incredible. Why are things produced? For profit. And capitalists say that this is good because profit means that there is a motive and interest for basically entrepreneurial-minded people to develop the economy and, expand productive activities and therefore sort of general material wealth of society as a byproduct, but as a good byproduct, because they're going to be personally, they're going to have personal kickbacks from that, right? Personal benefit. Socialists or people who oppose capitalism are going to say that this is bad because perhaps the production of things should be more related to the use value, therefore the sort of satisfaction of needs, rather than the profit of it. But hey, let's not get into these arguments, right? Now the society is called capitalism. Capitalism because money, which is a type of commodity, which is just crystallized value. Therefore, if we assume that the labor theory of value is correct, which I am doing because it's obvious that it's correct. Again, if I was an economist, I would actually have to argue about this, but just go along with me. Money becomes capital. Money, which is a crystallized value, which comes from labor, so it's crystallized labor, becomes capital if it buys goods whose consumption brings about an increase in the value of the commodity. Realize it when you sell it for a profit. Now, basically, what this means is when money is invested and returns almost magically in a higher quantity, that money is capital because you've invested in something and it's returned at a higher value than before. Therefore, it has given you a profit. What does this mean? This means that there is something called the means of production, which is what is used in the production of goods and sort of the transportation of goods and all that needs to be done to make the economy run, plus the labor needed to work said means of production. And basically, when money buys this stuff, it becomes capital, right? The basics of capitalism. So, for example, if we were to take our commodity, our Kerbal T-pose sticker right here, to make it, what you need is you need means of production and you need labor. The means of production would be basically a computer, a room to house that computer in, or an office, electricity to run the computer, and then the software that is on the computer. If you were to take, and I'm taking the example of the Kerbal T-pose sticker because this is what I used before, right? But of course, more commonly, you'd be thinking about, well, more commonly when this is explained in like a philosophy or an economics book, you're going to have like, I don't know, cotton, like a shirt, right? For the shirt, you need the material, the cotton yarn. Then you need a spinning machine or whatever, right? That spinning machine requires coal to run or requires electricity to run. It needs to be a building, blah, 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 right? This is the stuff that needs to exist for the thing to be produced materially. Then you need the labor, which is the person, like, for example, this probably underpaid intern man who's very white and also kind of red, and certainly he's very underpaid, clearly. And this guy is going to be like, okay, I am going to now enact a labor upon the means of production, which is going to turn the material that you have at the start, which in this case would be bits because this is a digital thing, but if it was again the shirt, it would be the cotton textile into the finished product, right? So what you have is that you have some values when you're calculating sort of profit, right? What you have is that you have these values that is basically how much does the software cost, right? So to make sure that I understand the value of the finished Kerbal T-pose sticker, how much does it cost for me to buy the software required to make it? In which case, I guess if you have GIMP, it's free. How much does it cost to have a computer and sort of a house? How much does it cost for each little piece of clip art that you make? How much does it cost in terms of electricity to run the computer for that long, right? At the end, you have basically the capital investment required for. You have the capital investment required for the means of production, which is, if you go by Marx, you'd call this constant capital. This is basically the capital that goes into inanimate objects that are, however, required to produce something. The labor is a different thing in and of itself, right? Because the labor is a sort of living, breathing being. It's not property. The labor in a capitalist society is free in terms of like it's a human being that is free to sell himself or not, right? So the labor is fundamentally different from the rest of the stuff because the labor has a kind of agency. Therefore, everything that has to deal with the labor is not just a relation of, not just a very simple sort of mathematic equation, it's also a social relation, right? And also, since it has agency and it's a human being and it's the one actually sort of doing the creative act of turning basically the material through the means of production into a finished product, the labor is what is creating the value. Because without the labor, none of this would be happening. Therefore, this is why the labor theory of value posits what it does, right? Therefore, it is a different type of investment. When you're investing into human beings, you're not investing into sort of something that is a fixed cost of production that is going to change only because of sort of market dynamics and, you know, the price of electricity or whatever, like why, whether or not there's a ship stuck in the Suez Canal or something like that. It's also going to change because of social and human dynamics. So what is, of course, the investment of capital into labor? It's wages. So it's the price of labor is wages. So what you have is that what Marx calls the constant capital, or what other economists call the cost of production, plus wages, or what Marx calls variable capital, is obviously going to be lower, at least in theory, if you're selling it for a profit than what you're selling the Kerbal T-Post sticker for. And what is the difference between these two values? You know, the final price and, you know, the sort of inanimate and animate cost of producing it would be the profit. Now, if you're a Marxist, you look at this and you say, haha, this means that the surplus value comes from basically unpaid labor that this man over here is performing because he has entered a social contract with the employer, whereupon the employer is going to give him the tools needed to do his job and a wage, which is, of course, going to be lower than, you know, than his contribution, because otherwise the whole system wouldn't work, because otherwise there wouldn't be any employers. Now, liberal economists would say that this is justified because the employer has basically done the investment into the material and the means of production and is doing the entrepreneurial sort of side of the business. And therefore, because of the risk of investment and because of the work he's doing on the sort of more managerial and entrepreneurial side, he came up with the idea, therefore he deserves however much rewards he is able to gain from the profit of the goods he is selling. And therefore it is even just for him to underpay his laborer, because otherwise the whole of society would be destroyed. Now, these are the two sides of the argument. Either you're literally extracting profit by basically forcing people into unpaid labor, otherwise they can't eat, or you are, you're the great entrepreneur that's basically moving society forward and therefore deserves a reward. This is the difference between classical economists and Marxist economists. However, later down the line, a lot of proponents of capitalism would refute the labor theory of value. Now, why do we need to know this when talking about Victoria Free? Well, because Victoria Free is a product in a capitalist society. And as we know, companies need to make profit off of their products. to stay in business and to satisfy the shareholders. Now, what does this mean? This means that in calculating basically, at least very, very roughly, the decision-making process of a company and how they go about sort of ordering their workers to produce their product, you need to take into consideration basically this mechanic of how value is produced, right? How value is added to nothing or to, raw materials, and how a product comes out of it that can make profit for the company and the shareholders. Now, a game development studio, I actually forgot to put some stuff in this, but the game development studio is going about making a game much in the same way as this unpaid or like this underpaid man over here, this underpaid proletarian, is going about making his curveball T-pose clip art. Because basically what they need is, your computers, your software, your electricity. Sort of the costs of making games. Again, I don't know in the detail, I don't know in full detail how exactly game development studios operate. I'm not a coder, I'm not a developer, I'm not a project manager, I'm not a game manager, I'm not whatever. So I can't tell you this 100% for sure, but this is a very, very well educated guess. How game development studios basically operate in terms of how the costs of production are divided between the sort of what Marx would say is the sort of the constant capital and the active capital, or what liberal economists would say is the cost of labor and the cost of production. I'm not sure. I don't know the proportions. I don't have access to paradoxes like balance sheets or whatever, expense sheets. But I can tell you that probably the costs of the stuff they use to make the games with is probably a hell of a lot lower than the labor, right? Now, what does this mean? What does this mean? Basically, it means that the what Marx calls the organic composition of capital, which is the relationship between the constant capital and the variable capital. So, the stuff and the people, to put it very simply, is skewed very heavily towards the people. So the investment has to mostly be in wages and into making sure that your workers are able to work. Because games are a very weird product, right? They're not like a car where, you design it once and then you produce 30,000 objects serially, 30,000 identical objects. What you do is you produce one object and you basically can copy it almost ad infinitum because the internet and computers, right? So it's a very, very sort of brainy and creative type of work, right? So since you don't need a lot of, which by the way is very contrary to a lot of the rest of the economy. Like with a lot of the rest of the economy, you have a trend where basically the investment that companies need to make into the means of production basically increases over time because of technological development and because of a bunch of other stuff, because of increased competition on the world market and a bunch of other reasons. So when you want to increase the profit, if you're producing physical goods, generally what happens is you need to basically acquire newer machines that can produce more in less time. Because if we assume, as we said earlier, that wages basically have a portion, they're divided between the portion that goes into paying for the workers' living expenses and for how much basically they're producing, and then the rest is the surplus value that goes into the profit of the owner. Well, if the worker in the same amount of labor hours is producing double, then of course that will increase the rate of profit, at least temporarily. Now, if this happens basically in a whole economic system, in a whole market, what's going to happen most likely is that someone is going to use that advantage to lower prices, and what that is going to result in is that everyone's going to copy their, in the case of Victoria II production methods, but everyone is going to copy their, their newer machines, and eventually the whole the value of the item will be different, because the labor involved in producing it will be socially modified. So this is why the labor theory of value does not posit, for example, that if I work an object like for my entire lifetime, then that automatically means that it's worth more than an industrially produced item of the same quality, because it's about socially average values. It's not about individual acts of labor, right? So in terms of physical goods, what you have is that the development of new technologies, more powerful machines, more smarter even machines that we have today, is basically means that in the same amount of time, the same worker can work more. Therefore, at the beginning, the rate of profit is going to increase, because you can sell more while paying the worker the same amount. They're effectively working more. But then later down the line, this leads to the rate of profit actually falling, because you're going to need to invest much more into these more complex means of production, these more complex machines, this more, heck, sometimes even more complex supply chain, more land to build your factories on, or whatever, right? So the amount of investment and then the rate of return on that investment is actually going to then lower over the long term, and the prices of these goods are going to fall tendentially. When it comes to a game, what you have is you have a low constant capital investment per product, because a game development studio is not going to be pumping out like 17 games per year, right? And there aren't really many ways in which you can make your your coders engineer a game faster, right? There are just human physiological time frames, unless at some point someone figures out like an AI that can automate a large part of the game development process, or unless it's like a really weird game that requires some level of physical product. I don't even know how that could work. So what happens is that if you want to increase the profits of your company, you're going to need to, your constant capital investment is going to be rather dull and unchanging. What you're going to want to sort of have action on is your variable capital, is your labor costs. Now, there are several ways of doing that, actually. The most obvious is, of course, paying people less, but maybe that's not the best idea, right? Because the way to increase profit for Paradox Interactive is to either lower salaries, which is difficult to do due to labor laws and worker turnover. Plus, salaries at Paradox, as far as I understand, are already pretty low compared to both Sweden and the industry standards. Now, why is worker turnover important? Because talent for game development studios is really valuable, because this is a very highly a lot of their jobs are very highly skilled. And so the cost cutting is kind of already, as far as I understand, I'll put some sources down in the description. As far as I understand, their cost cutting in this regard is kind of limited, their cost cutting options. And also, Paradox employees last year unionized. Therefore, they can't, like, it's going to be a lot more difficult for Paradox in a country like Sweden to cut wages, which is good. I like it when our underpaid proletarians get more of the value that they create, right? That's one option, lower salaries. That's going to increase your rate of profit. Another way would be to basically make people work for the same money, which is unpaid overtime, which is the same thing, effectively just the opposite. Instead of paying people less for the same amount of work, is paying people the same but making them work more. This is known as crunch in the game development industry. Unpaid overtime is very common, and as far as I understand, again, I'll put the sources down in the description. According to the developers of Paradox, that, you know, sort of quote unquote talked about the sort of development environment there. Apparently, it's already the case that they use some crunch. Plus, Paradox currently has a bunch of PR issues and sort of labor issues at the moment. Again, the fact that they unionized only last year in a country like Sweden should tell you that maybe maybe things were going better before then, right? If they were able to convince their workers not to unionize before then, probably it means that things took a bit of a nosedive. And again, they have some like female worker harassment issues. They have sort of general quality of working environment problems. They're basically, they can't really afford PR disasters like someone coming out and saying like, hey, for like hitting deadlines, they're making us work fucking 12 hours a day, right? Because that's a bad looker. That's a really bad looker. Not as much in the game development industry as in a lot of other industries, but it's still a bad looker. And there's one more, which I didn't put in there because I forgot, which is the one that they're doing right now. The reason why they're not putting War in Victoria free, and why in general, like, not just Paradox games, actually, like a lot of games, a lot of people are like, oh my god, games getting dumbed down or whatever. I mean, not really. Like, in their mechanics, they're getting dumbed down, but like the total development time and is probably higher because the technology is more complex. Therefore, game mechanics, there's less time for sort of quality control and developing game mechanics, because, as I said, you can't really, for a game development studio, you can't really increase the rate of profit by increasing your productivity through improving the stuff you use to make your games with, right? That's not exactly how, you know, game development works. It's very much a human, sort of highly creative work, right? How do you increase the productivity of an engineer? Yeah, I guess if he's using pen and paper and you give him a computer, that's going to increase his productivity. But I mean, really, the only way is going to be to like either increasing the productivity of the engineer or paying him less, or making him do less work for the same product, i.e. removing game mechanics. That's essentially my crackpot theory. My idea is, we'll get to this final slide in a little bit. By the way, do you love how I have slides? My idea is that Paradox needs to release Victoria free because of these reasons that we'll see. Needs to release Victoria free, and they don't really have like a lot of leeway in delaying the launch. They can't really enslave their developers more, which by the way is good. Like, frankly, if I was a Paradox worker, again, I'm making a lot of assumptions, but by the way, if somehow this ends up being watched by someone at Paradox, please tell me whether or not like my itch is correct. It would be a hell of a lot better for them to like, this is like, it's the only game, why you have to be mad? Like, if a bunch of people have to be like have to have their lives like somewhat ruined for months upon months, just to make sure that the game is good, then frankly I prefer that they're still getting paid and the game is bad and their life is not ruined, rather than that the final product is better, right? The ideal would be that they pay them more and then they delay the game, right? But that's not how capitalism works, because capitalism works by maximizing profit. Therefore, if the profit isn't increasing because for some reason the prices aren't increasing, then either the constant costs of the constant capital invested has to be lower, or the variable capital invested needs to be lower. Therefore, if you're in an industry where constant capital cannot really be lower than what it is right now, then you're going to lower the variable capital. You're going to lower the labor costs. If you're lowering the labor costs, you have these options. Some of them are impossible. Therefore, what you're going to do is you're going to cram less stuff into the same product. Now, Paradox is in trouble currently. This is the report that they released. Basically, over the first 9 months of 2021 compared to the same period in 2020, their revenues were 1,056.9 millions of Swedish krona. And that is a decrease of 22% compared to the same period last year. So that's yikes. I'm guessing that, last year it was 1,360 million Swedish krona. And their operating profit has decreased by 71%. Now, there's a reason why. It's because they've canceled a lot of titles, and that's basically just a bunch of money down the drain for them that they were spending that isn't going to generate any return. So that's of course rather bad for them. They made some bad investments basically. They've switched around CEOs. The woman that was in charge has stepped down, and it's now, I believe, the man who was previously the CEO of Paradox before, like a few years ago. And he has commented saying basically that they're underperforming. And basically, they say that currently their temporary sort of low profits are because of the recurring costs linked to write-downs of canceled projects. Basically, again, they invested money into stuff that they're never going to release, so that's just money down the drain. However, we have also had delays in our game development, which have led to too few releases of new content for our core games. Now, this is very important because the game development sort of cycle is very long. To release basically how game development studios are making their money is that they have a long cycle of development during which they're operating at a loss, and then a payday once the product releases, right? Which is why currently in such a difficult position for the company. Now, I don't think they're in any danger of potentially even going bankrupt or anything like that. They've got 7 studios, they got 500 employees, so they're healthy, they're going to live. Their stock price has risen again because of some of their downsizing and restructuring that they've done. But they need to do the restructuring, and they cannot afford really delays in releases. They also cannot afford to cram more time, or even they obviously can't afford to pay more people to do the same job in less time because they need the profits, right? And paying more people would be expensive at the moment and also inefficient. They also cannot really enslave their workers even more, therefore squeezing more surplus value out of them the sort of traditional way, because they have some PR issues. They've got the workers have recently unionized, therefore it's going to be just a nightmare from a sort of internal politics standpoint. Again, this is all based on sort of semi-conjecture, but I think this is what's happening. I'm pretty damn sure this is what's happening. I am 95% sure that I am right. And in a longer perspective, the quarter's results are an effect of investments in externally developed products where we must improve at all times, controlling game vision, quality, and progress. We have seen low velocity in our internally developed projects. In these respects, we have been too passive, something we are now rectifying. Now, this is something that the guy has released today, but what this sentence essentially means, I'm going to translate it in English. We're going to release our games faster, and we're going to be doing that in one way or another, right? This is reassuring the shareholders that their investment is going to bear fruit. So basically, the option that is the easiest, in my opinion, is to make the game simpler so that they can be released earlier. And in fact, this sort of has the potential to increase profitability in the sort of medium term, because this is going to also allow for sort of DLC content to be more effective. It's still kind of a gamble, because maybe people are going to be mad about like the products being, kind of dumbed down. But it's, I think, the only way Paradox has of getting themselves out of this currently dangerous, not critically dangerous, but not exactly ideal situation, so that they're, in the medium to long term in a better position to sort of reevaluate their development strategy. So what I think has happened is basically that Paradox, that Victoria Free, basically was in the firing line, right? The development of this game came at a very unfortunate time, and it got caught in the sort of the crossfire. So yeah, tell me what you think about this. I'm going to also upload this as a separate video. In fact, you might be watching this as a separate video. Yeah, I want to thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And please debate down in the comments and tell me why I should be executed, because I am a godless communist. See you soon.